Dear Mom and Dad, I've been at a sleepaway camp for almost 3 weeks, and I'm getting very scared.
It's pretty easy to forget that some of the slasher films that were released during the 1980s through to the year 2000 even happened. I mean, that 20-year space is filled to the brim with cheap attempts to cash in on what were originally great movies. I think it's also pretty easy to forget that despite the cheap sleaziness that comes with some of these things, some of them end up going down in infamy, whether that be for better or for worse. Now, some of these films would end up spanning long-running franchises, some of them would end up in limbo, and some of them were just so bad right from the off that they're actually kind of enjoyable. However, there are some films from this era that are verging on so problematic that they are still a talking point even now within the horror community. Sleepaway Camp is but one of the many films that I am alluding to here. Now, since discovering it in June of 2019 when it was covered on the Kill Count, I've grown an odd fondness for this frankly bizarre movie. To put it bluntly, this is a film that is a cult classic, it has a very loyal following, and it might also just be the definition of the term, you can't make this today. Looking back on it, it's a movie that in one swoop manages to somehow come across as both transphobic and homophobic, and yet despite this, it continues to have a following. Quick disclaimer here, because yes, I do enjoy the mess that is Sleepaway Camp and its sequels. Despite the problematic nature of its ending, I do feel there is more to be discussed here. I am by no means the first person to do it, and I will definitely not be the last. I also just wanted to make it known that I do not excuse any of the transphobic elements within this film. I just believe that Sleepaway Camp is such a substantial cornerstone of the subgenre itself, and it's also just a really interesting way to look at how we perceived things back then compared to how this film has been reappropriated in the modern lens. Bear in mind that we will also be discussing spoilers for this film. It did come out in 1983, so you're not really missing out on anything fresh. However, if you do want to see it without any idea of what's going on, consider that your warning. Now, if you want to get technical, since we're in the UK, I should probably be referring to this film as Nightmare Vacation, as that's what it received when it got released here. However, I don't know if you're going to agree with me, but I think that title sucks in comparison to what we have as the more iconic one, so we're going to go with that. It was written and directed by Robert Hiltzig, and this, along with 2008's return to Sleepaway Camp, would be the only films he ever directed. Now, I'm not sure if that's a result of a personal choice or how these two movies turned out. I will let you be the sole judge of that. Now, if someone were to say that Sleepaway Camp was incredibly derivative of the original Friday the 13th, I would hardly be able to defend it. Releasing 3 years after the movie that kickstarted the grip that Jason Voorhees would go on to have, there are definite similarities in terms of the setting, the whodunit aspect, and the overall style of the film. Sleepaway Camp follows the story of Angela, a young girl sent to a summer camp that quickly becomes the site of a series of murders shortly after she arrives. We do learn a little on Angela's backstory in the film's opening scene, finding out that she, along with her sibling, their father, and his boyfriend, were all on a boating trip. On this trip, there's an incident that results in the boat capsizing, but when they try to swim ashore, they drift right into the path of a reckless motorboat, leaving her father and her brother killed.
Oh my God! Somebody help the people!
We jump forward to 1983, 8 years later, where the majority of this movie takes place. There we're met with a traumatized Angela. She's very quiet and reserved, and we can tell from the first moment with Aunt Martha and Cousin Ricky that she isn't by any means an outgoing person. This unfortunately does mean that when they're sent off to Camp Arawak, Angela is seen as an easy target by the other kids and is bullied for it. The main instigators of this being Judy, someone her own age, and Meg, a counsellor who seems to be friendly with Judy. There is a horrible moment a little later in the movie where the head cook, Artie, attempts to do something pretty bad to Angela. However, I do take great pleasure in saying that the creep absolutely gets what's coming to him. A little later that same day, an unknown figure enters the kitchen in what's actually a very similar first-person style of shot to that in the likes of 1980's Friday the 13th. Thanks to this person, we're able to see this asshole fall to the floor coated in scalding water that he was in the process of boiling. From this point, I do think that every single kill in the film only makes the eventual killer reveal more obvious. We're thrown red herrings like all of the time, with Mel, the camp owner, seeming pretty suspicious himself, considering he's very quick to deem the incident involving RA as an accident. He later goes on to try and throw the blame onto Ricky, who is another red herring at various points during the film. Various other campers end up mocking Angela too, which ends up in a fight between them and Ricky and his friend Paul. Paul becomes somewhat of a surprise friend for Angela, whereas one of the people mocking Angela ends up dead a few scenes later via a drowning. This is yet another death that's ruled as accidental by Mel, further reinforcing him as just another terrible misdirection that this movie tries to feed us. Another two campers pick on Angela, and yet again another one of them ends up dead when he's trapped with a beehive, which finally makes Mel begin to wonder if there's a killer, finally ending this terrible red herring. In between all of this, Paul makes a move on Angela and kisses her. However, this relationship does grow a little strained when he kisses her again, which causes Angela to have this really weird flashback to her youth when she and her brother witnessed their father in bed with his boyfriend. Now, we will talk a little more on this one soon, I just wanted to bring it up right now. During some capture the flag thing, Angela walks into a clearing to see Judy kissing Paul, and out of guilt he tries to explain himself at the lake, but is quickly hurried off by Judy and Meg. These guys work as a tag team to throw this poor girl into the water despite the clear fear she has. So far, if this film has taught me anything, it's that children are pricks. Ricky helps her out, and as they're on their way out of there, they have sand flung at them by a bunch of children. Ricky goes on to swear that he'll get revenge, and this is probably the one time I will give this movie praise for an attempted red herring, because this one is actually pretty good. We see Meg stabbed to death in the shower next during the night of the camp social. Paul apologises to Angela here again, and she tells him a time and place to meet. Paul is clearly excited by this, and this is the last time we'll see of him for now, so let's just stop talking about him. Mel finds Meg's body and... oh yeah, this is a thing. Mel has something going on with this, pretty young counsellor. I don't know her exact age, but... it's just so odd, man. In other areas, 4 of the 6 children who threw sand at Angela are found dead. Judy is next being killed by really disturbing means. From here, the camp is thrown into complete disarray with all of the deaths occurring, which, being honest, is probably the first rational thing that this film has actually done since the 5-minute baseball segment.
No problem, Gino. This guy blows dead dogs. Just lay it in there.
Eat shit and die, Ricky!
Eat shit and live, Bill.
From here we have the anti-hero. Mel sets out in revenge after losing Meg, and assuming Ricky is the killer, he attacks him and just beats the absolute fuck out of him. And then he's shot by the real killer. This, however, is where the problematic aspect of this movie does come to play. As police search for the missing campers, we see Paul at the beach with Angela, who suggests that the two go for a swim. As 2 counsellors search the woods, they come across a naked Angela humming and clutching 2 things to note. So let's see here, there's a hunting knife, oh, and that's Paul's head. The big twist of this movie is shown here. Angela stands and is actually revealed to be Peter, her thought to be dead brother. It's revealed here that in that opening scene, it's actually the real Angela that dies in the boating incident, and it was Peter that survived. After Aunt Martha gained custody, however, she chose to raise Peter as the daughter that she had longed for. The movie ends on this incredibly unsettling shot as Angela stands before the shocked Susie and Ronnie, who discover that she was the killer all along. She stares at them with her face manic, letting out this horrific animalistic hissing sound as the movie ends. That is literally the final shot you are forced to look at. This movie, looking back on it with, 40 odd years of progression, it's incredibly clear to see that this hasn't aged well. However, one thing that does fascinate me, and it's what initially drove me to make this video, is that part of the legacy that this film franchise has been built on comes from that twist. And, not even necessarily being hated on, more so how it's slowly beginning to be recontextualized through a modern lens. Sleepaway Camp is such an odd product of its time, almost a fragment of the 80s that shows just how out of touch things were back then. To have a movie so blissfully unaware of the issues that it was feeding is insane, and I do think it's probably unique in the sense that they were very clearly tone deaf when making this. The evolution of the analysis of this film has developed from the likes of, this is an open and shut portrayal of a film feeding into the LGBT panic that was so rife back in the 80s, into something so much more complex. Stated in a great article from Harmony Colangelo back in 2020, I think this is truly one of the best analyses of the film I've seen. The biggest twist of this film isn't the characters finding out that she was the killer, it's finding out that Angela isn't really Angela.
God, she's a boy.
There isn't a resolution. We don't see her killed or captured. We don't see her escape. We're told that she's the killer, but also that she's not who we've been told she is the entire movie. As the article states, however, to call this film bad trans representation would be incredibly accurate. It would only be telling half of the story. When we look at horror, it's meant to shock us, it's meant to scare us. That is the intention of every single horror film, and this one isn't any different. Where this one stands out is how it chooses to accomplish that. To put it simply, Sleepaway Camp exploits the homosexual and transgender panic. I could go into more detail here, but I honestly do feel like the article does a much better job than I could ever do of explaining that. A link will be in the description. I do highly recommend giving it a quick read. The basis of the article, or at least a large portion of it, is that the problem in this film is not Angela Baker, rather the world and the circumstances that surround her. When looking at and dissecting everything that takes place over the course of this film, it's clear to see that Angela is more a victim than anything else. As far as we know, Peter was happy as a boy and would not have transitioned if not for Aunt Martha's force. Now, this is something that is potentially retconned in a sequel later on down the line, which again I will get to in just a second. The murders within this film likely wouldn't have occurred if not for this catalyst. Everyone killed by Angela was killed because of the way she was treated by them. You know, had she gone to camp as Peter, I don't think the bullying would have been completely gone. I think the article does a very good job of highlighting that much. But the constant brainwashing and warping of Peter's mind by Aunt Martha likely leads to why Angela was so quiet and confused, which ultimately made her an easy target for the bullies at the camp. This is where it gets a little interesting, however, because while it's fictional, if you choose to look at this from the angle of true crime, a lot of murderers were forced to cross-dress by guardians. Now, while it's important to note that this isn't always the case, I do think it's necessary to consider, because to be forced to present or live as a gender you do not identify as could result in high levels of psychological damage. This in turn could manifest itself in feelings of anger, shame, or even depression. As the article suggests, whether intentional or not, Sleepaway Camp does tap into real-world parallels. Angela is a victim here, a tragic example of just how important gender expression can actually be. In Angela's mind, she's still Peter, being addressed by everyone with a name she doesn't want, a name she doesn't own, and as a result, it's misgendering her. This almost plays in reverse to many other films that have transitioning as an aspect of the story. But because of this, as well as it being attached to Sleepaway Camp, it's almost entirely disregarded, and for me, while I don't think we should necessarily celebrate this film, and what it intentionally or unintentionally wants to say, I don't think it should ever actually be forgotten. It's such an odd placement within the horror spectrum because, you know, this doesn't align solely with slasher films. Sleepaway Camp does contain a lot of other tropes featured in subgenres like the R-word revenge genre. It, much like slasher films, is another very exploitative corner of the horror genre. Now that is a genre spearheaded most notably by the I Spit in Your Grave franchise. However, I think to lump Sleepaway Camp in with this sort of thing, because like it or not, it does have those tropes, I think it adds another divisive layer onto this movie entirely. The sequels both do and don't do much to build on the legacy of Sleepaway Camp, if that's something you could even call it. On one hand, the second and third movies attempt to delve more into a black comedy approach, relying more on over-the-top killings as opposed to shock reveals. Gone is the whodunit angle. Angela's more of a Jason type character now, with the only difference being that she's actively mingling with her victims before their deaths. By this regard, it could even be seen as somewhat of a step in the right direction. You know, at first Angela's real identity was a big twist, the focal point of the movie. In the following two movies, it's not even remotely mentioned. Angela is just Angela now, treated not as a transgender woman, rather just a woman. The issues do arise, however, when you consider the fact that that means the film is sort of pushing itself in one of two directions without really committing to either. Certain elements of the first movie are retconned, so there is a small amount of reason that fans have to suggest that this is the reality, that certain parts of that movie, like the transgender aspect, have been retconned because of the problematic nature of them. This then means that while they have potentially erased a transgender character, it shows a conscious effort to right the wrongs that they did within the first film. The interesting sequels do come next though. With the second and third installment being released in 1988 and 1989 respectively, a fourth film was actually put into production in 1992, with filming set to begin in October. However, due to the production company going bankrupt, the film was shut down with only around 30 minutes of footage shot. Somehow, however, a full theatrical release was cobbled together for release in 2012. I haven't ever seen it, but I can't imagine it flows that well. 2008's return to Sleepaway Camp acts as an attempted return to form for the series. With the original director returning, this actually predates the requel trend we're seeing nowadays with the likes of Halloween and other franchises, ignoring the second and third installments, choosing to instead be a standalone sequel to the first film. This one also had the likes of Felissa Rose and Jonathan Tiersten reprising their roles as Angela and Ricky, proving that for these two at least, Sleepaway Camp wasn't just a stain on their resume. This was something they actually cared about, at least enough to return. Feeling there was more of a story to tell, making Sleepaway Camp a truly bizarre landmark in the evolution of horror. Not so much because of the sequels, rather how it got there from where it began.
Michael thought skinning frogs was cool. Ask him how cool it is now.
When analysing Sleepaway Camp, there are multiple different ways to approach it. For one, it's a movie that has aged terribly in pretty much every aspect imaginable. You know, a movie with sequels that aren't quite sure if they want to build from the original or fix it. Sleepaway Camp is a tainted piece of horror history. And like all history, it's important to address the mistakes that have been made, as that's how we're going to move forward and evolve. To forget it happened or sweep it under the rug would almost be a shame and a disservice to what this bizarre little franchise has done for the genre.
Judy, she's a real carpenter's dream. The lattice of board and needs a screw.
Oddly enough, I do actually think there's a place in the modern horror landscape for a remake of this movie. That might sound insane, but for me, a modern retelling could open the door to explore the themes of gender dysphoria that are subtly present within the original film. Yet at the same time, it could improve and right the wrongs that the original took in terms of its transgender representation. Like I've said, I believe it's important to acknowledge the wrongs that were committed in the original Sleepaway Camp. But the series itself is going to continue to boast this truly bizarre legacy within horror that I don't think will ever truly be forgotten.